Very excited to introduce Michael Kazin. Michael is a professor of history at Georgetown University, where he's an expert on U.S. politics and social movements, particularly during the 19th and 20th centuries. He is also the editor emeritus of Dissent magazine. His previous works include American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation, which was named a best book in 2011 by The New Republic, Newsweek, Daily Beast, and The Progressive. His latest book is What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. It tells the story of the U.S.'s most enduring political party and its quest, however imperfectly, for moral capitalism from Andrew Jackson to Joseph Biden. Michael's book is already garnering widespread praise, and I thought I'd share a quote from someone who unfortunately couldn't be here this evening. Congressman Jamie Raskin wrote, "Michael Kazin has written a necessary and indispensable book about the history of the party that Martin Van Buren used to call the democracy, a nickname that we badly need to dust off." This afternoon, Michael will be in conversation with the incomparable Jane Mayer. Jane has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1995. The magazine's chief Washington correspondent, she covers politics, culture, and national security. And previously having worked at the Wall Street Journal, well, she covered the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, the Gulf War, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. She is also the author of the 2016 Times bestseller Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right, which the Times named as one of the 10 best books of the year. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming them both to Politics and Prose.
Before Jane, can you hear me okay? Before Jane asks questions, Congressman Raskin asked me to apologize for, unfortunately, having a positive test. He's feeling okay. He said about 90%. But he said he wanted to see some people who are probably here and be disappointed not to be able to see him. So hello for Congressman Raskin. But I'm a big baseball fan, though we don't have baseball right now, unfortunately. But if you're going to get a pinch hitter, not bad to have a pinch hitter like Jane Mayer. So thanks very much, Jane, for coming in. Jane.
Well, thanks, Michael. I am not Jamie Raskin, but I have the distinct. What is it, Nancy Pelosi always says? The high honor and distinct pleasure of a privilege of being here with the eminent historian, who I'm so glad to join, Michael Kazin, and I've crash read the book, and I can tell you it's actually fantastic. It's really well written. It's really fun to read, full of illuminating things about where we are today, though Michael says he wants to talk about history. And I have some questions, actually, a couple questions from Congressman Raskin that he sent. So he is my Cyrano. And the first one is, in what sense is this still Thomas Jefferson's party? And in what sense is it not?
Well, thank you, Congressman Raskin. Actually, in the book, I argue that Thomas Jefferson is seen by many people as the founder of the Democratic Party, but actually Thomas Jefferson was not crazy about competitive parties. He really wanted his party to be the only party. And when Thomas Jefferson was the head of what was called the Democratic Republicans at the time, it was a very small party, more like a party of notables than a real mass party like the one that was founded in the 1820s. But the idea that the Democratic Party should stand for equal rights for all, special privileges to none, that it should be the party of the ordinary working person, even though for Jefferson, of course, that only meant the ordinary white working person, is still, I think, sort of resonates in a lot of Democratic Party rhetoric even today. You hear some of Joe Biden's speeches, and the themes are still there, I think, even though Democrats don't celebrate Jefferson anymore for rather obvious reasons. There used to be Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners, which were one of the major ways Democratic Party in various states and cities raised money for the party. And the Democratic Party is not celebrating Jefferson and Jackson anymore, again, for obvious reasons. They're more likely to be celebrated by Republicans like Donald Trump, who put a picture of Jackson on his wall in the White House. But in the sense that the Democrats are still the party that believes, officially at least, in equal rights for all, special privileges to none, a party that aims to represent the great majority of people who are not rich and not well-born and don't have fancy educations. I think that's still, at least on the surface, still true.
It's interesting, though, given that if you look at the demographics of who is a member of the Democratic Party, increasingly the Democratic Party is losing the white working class voters, and the rhetoric coming out of the Republican Party is sort of strongly anti-elitist, describing Democrats as being the elites. So I guess I wonder is, why is that, and can the Democratic Party continue to be the party of the people without the working class white voters? Can it succeed without them?
No, that's a great question. An obvious question and a great one as well. I think no. I think Democrats, after all, white people is about 72% of the population, and even though that's a declining number, they tend to vote more than non-white people still. And when Democrats were a party that did have a majority of white working class people on their side, it's when they stood for universal programs like Social Security, Medicare, the Wagner Act, which enabled the government to help unions organize. They seemed to be the party that wanted to help the great majority. And unfortunately, I think unfairly, in the 1960s, the Democrats got the reputation among a lot of white working people as being the party for minorities, a party also of the cultural elite, of college-educated liberals who opposed the Vietnam War, for example. And those cultural issues continue to resonate, I think. Good example is West Virginia, which used to be an incredibly core Democratic state, where one of the first states called on election night every 4 years was West Virginia, and it was called for Democrats. And why was that? It was a white working class state then. It's a white working class state now. It was because there was a very strong union, the United Mine Workers of America, which was the largest institution, citizen institution in West Virginia, and it was an institution which backed the Democratic Party, which not just didn't just turn people out to vote, it also educated people, white working class people in West Virginia, about why the Democratic Party was their party, was the party that was trying to govern in their interest. And without institutions like that, without white working class institutions like the United Mine Workers, which are not just white working class institutions, also had a lot of African Americans in it, it's very difficult, I think, for the Democrats to get beyond the cultural issues which Republicans have been very effective, Donald Trump especially, at convincing a lot of white working class voters that the Democrats are an elitist party, because so many Democrats are obviously from so many elite backgrounds, at least a lot of people in government and some of their fundraisers, some of the people who give them a lot of money. And also, a lot of the issues that Democrats have been fighting about are issues that a lot of white working class people, especially those who are churchgoers, oppose, like abortion, for example. I'm not saying Democrats should not, be pro-choice. They must be pro-choice. But at the same time, if those issues are the ones that church-going white working people think about, that's what Democrats are for, then you're not going to pick up their votes. And there have always been cultural issues that mattered in America, but when those issues are primary at a time like now, it's very difficult, I think, for the Democrats to win back white working class voters. Though I should say among young white working class people, that's beginning to change. And that is a positive development, I think, because they're, I think, less interested in the older antagonisms than their parents are, by and large.
I'm going to give you another of the Raskin questions, which
Okay.
I think goes also to the heart of your argument, but which is that you argue in the book that the cohesive theme of the Democratic Party when they have won is adherence to something that you call moral capitalism. And so what actually is that? How does it differ from what the Republican Party believes about capitalism? And basically, can you explain its role in
Sure.
the kind of Democratic Party?
Actually, I got that term from my friend Liz Cohen, who's a very good historian, teaches up at Harvard, nice, populist institution. And she wrote a great book called Making a New Deal, where she argued that what working people across racial lines and ethnic lines wanted during the 1930s was a moral capitalism, really a fair deal, higher wages, bosses who would treat them fairly. And that's one aspect of moral capitalism. In general terms, though, I think it's a capitalist society which gives people opportunities, which doesn't let businesses be so big that they turn small business out of circulation, that the Amazons and the Walmarts and the Facebooks, shouldn't be the economic powers in the land, squeezing everybody else out. That's part of it, sort of anti-monopoly aspect of moral capitalism. The other aspect is helping working people to be able to form unions, to get better wages, better working conditions. And I call it moral capitalism because even though I've been a leftist for a long time, and in Europe I'd probably be a member of a socialist party, here I think most Americans of any class don't, at least not yet, want anything like socialism. They like the idea of a market system. They like the idea of being able to become rich through your own work and diligence and intelligence. But they also think that the very rich should not have a tremendous amount of power over everybody else. They also think that people should be treated decently at the workplace. And that's what I mean by moral capitalism. And I think when the Democrats have done well, when they've dominated the political system, which has not been that often in American history, but when they have, it's because they've been able to put forth a vision of what you could call moral capitalism, to represent the great majority of people against an economic elite. And Joe Biden and Democratic leaders in Congress, and most Democrats who are in Congress, except for a couple senators from places you've heard about, I think are in favor of that vision and in favor of programs to carry out that vision. But obviously, because of the very narrow majorities that Democrats have, they haven't been able to turn most of those programs into law. But also, the Democrats have not visibly, I should say, not visibly, but have not prominently been in favor of such a vision and a few well-publicized programs to really embody that vision for quite a long time. And that's part of the problem. A lot of people out there might remember, if they're old enough, the New Deal or the Great Society, but it's not quite clear to a lot of Americans what the Democrats really stand for. People know what they don't like, just so they know what the Republicans don't like, but not clear that they really know what Democrats want. And that's a problem of messaging, but it's also a problem of not having those working class institutions on the side of the Democratic Party, especially trade unions, which used to help educate working people about what the Democrats want.
Well, in the history of the Democratic Party, it seems you've described, at least in the more modern period, the working coalition that existed under FDR of trade unions, Southern Democrats, and sort of big city bosses, basically machines, and that coalition
and left-wing intellectuals like us.
And left-wing intellectuals. That coalition was sort of really what kept the party strong. Does that coalition still exist? Is it still workable? And if it's not, what do you replace it with?
Yeah. Well, of course, the southern part barely exists, if it exists at all, except. Georgia, which is mostly black voters, of course, and some white liberal voters, was an exception in the last election. But that's pretty much the only one. And Virginia, which, except for the last gubernatorial election, some of that coalition was put together. But the coalition now is what you refer to sometimes as a sort of dumbbell coalition. I don't mean stupid bell, but that is strong at one end, educated, urban, suburban voters, of different races, and at the other end, recent immigrants, most African Americans, most Latino voters still, even though there's been some erosion among Latino voters, who tend to be some of the poorer people in America too. So you've got two poles, which Democrats are their core constituencies. But as you said before, the middle there, which is white working people, white lower middle class people, have been gravitating more towards the Republicans. So when Democrats can pick up more of those people and convince them the Democrats are still their party or their party again, then they can have a victorious coalition. They don't have to have, actually, they don't have, in terms of numbers, they don't have to have the majority of white working class people on their side, but they have to avoid losing that constituency by 20 or 30 points, which is what they're doing now, I think. And that's begun to happen, and partly why I keep stressing unionism and have some distinguished labor attorney in the back there, Craig Becker, among other folks, is because Democrats have not found another way to talk to and organize working class people since the decline of private sector unions, you know. And if I could think of another institution, another way, sort of bottom-up way for those people to be convinced the Democratic Party is a party that they should vote for and support, I would be brilliant and I would write about it. But I don't know of another institution besides that, and that's the problem. So so that's one of the reasons why we have such a, you know, close rivalry between the two parties, because Republicans are mostly a white Christian party. Democrats are a very heterogeneous party. They're a broad coalition, but they lack in the center that white working class constituency, which they used to have when they were the New Deal Party, the Fair Deal Party, the Great Society Party, and the Union Party as well.
I guess I wonder how much race has been an issue that has splintered the Democratic Party from the days back in the, you know, the New Deal era. I remember, you know, reading about LBJ saying when he signed the Voting Rights Act, you know, that's the end of the Democratic Party winning for the next whatever it was,
the White South,
generation
yeah,
or something
yeah.
like that. There goes the White South. And is this how big an issue do you think this has been historically in changing the fortunes of the Democratic Party and the character of it too?
Yeah. Well, Democratic Party until the late 1930s was almost explicitly, sometimes explicitly, often explicitly a racist party. I mean, they supported slavery, they supported the expansion of slavery, they were the main people supporting and installing the Jim Crow system in the South after Reconstruction ended. And until the 1930s, the single largest bloc of the Democrats in both the Senate and the House were always Southern Democrats. And 1930s, that began to change when FDR won these huge majorities. And the Democrats did begin to move away from that heritage. And actually, the unions were part of that, because the unions were, the industrial unions of CIO were interracial unions. And they were important to winning Democratic victories in a lot of big Midwestern states, which had been voting Republican before, like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin, Michigan. But really it wasn't until the late 40s that Democrats really do come out in favor of a civil rights bill. And then, as you said, it wasn't until the 60s that they passed these bills. How important is racism still? Well, obviously, racism still exists and is very strong in many ways. But I do think that the way at least most people who object to, you know, Black Lives Matter talk about it in many ways is they sort of feel like the Democrats are favoring these other people. They're not helping us. They think, well, how come Democrats are always talking about race and blaming us? And you saw this in the Virginia and the whole school debate as well. And though, of course, I don't support that, and I don't feel that's actually true, again, politics is perception, as you know, and if the perception is there that Democrats are the party that primarily wants to help black people or LGBT people or any other, you know, minority of the population, then it's going to have a problem, you know, winning over people who feel like, well, what about us? And the what about us can be a racist way of asking that question, or it can just be a way of saying, we're not doing that well either in this economy with COVID, you know, we lost a lot of good jobs here in West Virginia, coal jobs, for example, or manufacturing jobs in the Midwest. So, you know, what about us? And that began to happen in the late 60s already, of course, the backlash against civil rights. I talk about this famous report that the Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg did in Macomb County, Michigan, right outside of Detroit, where in the 1980s he's trying to figure out why all these auto workers and their families were voting for Ronald Reagan. And he basically said, because they're the party of those people in Detroit, you know, those black people in Detroit. A lot of whom were also UAW members. I mean, that's the terrible irony of it. Was that purely a racist? Well, it was racist, but racism is not a simple thing. Racism is not just, I don't like those people because they have a different color. Race is about, you know, it can be meritocratic, it can be populist, it can be, in a weird way, democratic, you know, how about the great majority? So I think Democrats have not been smart enough about how they talk about that. And again, you can't change the question, but when the question's out there of racism and Black Lives Matter and racial justice, but you also have to say, this is not all we were for. We also, and I think Joe Biden's tried to do this, we also want to help the great majority, and this is how, specifically, this is how. And this is why these programs will be good for you. And that hasn't gotten out there as much as, I think, as the question of, Democrats being the pro-Black party, which a lot of Black people think they're not pro-Black enough, of course, because racism's still there in many ways. So, but we're a big, complicated country, and that's the problem. You put together a governing coalition and a winning coalition, which is the point of my book, how do you do that, and how they've done that in the past. You got to make some people somewhat unhappy in order to get a coalition which is happy enough to win.
I guess I wondered if, going back to the Stan Greenberg study and before it, what did the Democrats do in the 70s or 60s and 70s that ushered in, what did they do wrong that ushered in Reagan and the Bushes?
Yeah.
And what does one learn from that?
Great question. Well, first of all, I'm a historian, and historians know, as important as parties are in this country, they don't control what happens, in most ways, I won't use a four-letter word because it'll be on television, but that happens, right? And it happened. Now, part of the problem, of course, was the Vietnam War, which you can blame Democrats for, unfortunately. It escalated in the war. I mean, that split the Democratic Party in 1968, of course, and then when the stagflation of the 1970s happened, even though Republicans were in power for a lot of that until Jimmy Carter got elected in '76, people got used to, from the Great Depression onward, they got used to government sort of taking control of the economy, and they got used to government having responsibility for the economy being stable or prosperous. And I mean, that's the sort of Keynesian, and the success of Keynesianism was, I think, that people said, well, I guess the government is responsible for the economy, and if we're unemployed, that's the government's fault. And even now, presidents keep saying, I created so many jobs, as if, they're creating jobs digging ditches like Franklin Roosevelt did. But at the same time, Democrats did not understand, I think, the need to keep empowering the government to help people. Jimmy Carter is a very nice man, unfortunately is, I think, the primary culprit there. He really thought government was too powerful. He was a Southern Democrat, after all. That's by heritage, even though he was not a racist. Was a supporter of civil rights. And unions, for example, wanted to relax the Wagner Act, let's reform the Wagner Act to make it easier to organize unions, and he was too busy trying to get the Panama Canal Treaty through Congress to worry about that, even though all union leaders said, we really need this, to shore up unions which were in decline, being attacked by employers in various ways. There was also a bill called the Humphrey-Hawkins Bill, which named after Senator Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, and Augustus Hawkins, black congressman from LA, which would have made the government the employer of last resort. People couldn't find jobs in the private sector. The government would create jobs. It was controversial, but it had majority support in the polls, and Jimmy Carter didn't want any of it. And so a very weak bill was passed. So in other words, he stopped being the, you might say, the moral capitalist president, I think, and was concerned just to make sure, and look, there was a real problem at the time, as you know. There was runaway inflation, and interest rates were sky high and so forth, so he just wanted to make sure. But in many ways, the economic crisis of the 70s helped conservatives, helped elect Ronald Reagan for sure in 1980, and then Democrats after that for a long time until arguably Barack Obama felt like, well, we have to be very careful. We can't really say anything that sounds too left-wing on the economy. We can't really, want to support big government programs again, because if we do, we'll lose. Because Ronald Reagan successfully said, big government is an evil thing, and that explains a lot Democrats' doldrums, I think, in the 80s and 90s.
If I remember correctly, you say that it's astonishing looking back that people thought that Carter could get reelected in 1980, right?
Well, that's partly because of Iran, too. It wasn't just the economy, but yeah.
But I wanted to ask you a little bit about, in your approach to the book, you write a little bit about yourself and your own experience as a former student radical. And I wondered, why did you decide to weave that in? And when you look back at your own role, how do you place it in the history of the Democratic Party? You were an outsider rather than an insider in the party. You were running a movement outside of the party, and I wonder, was the left? Do you think that split helped the party because it needed to be pushed from the outside, or do you think it hurt the party?
Well, I mentioned myself just because sort of intellectual honesty. I decided to write this book partly because I've been a Democrat with a capital D for a long time, and I'm a Democrat with a small d, I hope, as well. And also, my son Danny has been a Democratic Party operative since he was in college. And in some ways that inspired me to write the book too, because he taught me a lot about the insides of the Democratic Party, how it works right now, since he's been part of it. But also, as I mentioned, the Vietnam War, when I was 12 years old, I handed out leaflets for John F. Kennedy on the streets of my hometown, Englewood, New Jersey, a suburb of New York, and I wore a huge pin, Kennedy Johnson pin, the size of a small pie or pot pie, on my sweater or jacket every day at school, in a very Republican private school, actually. But the Vietnam War really radicalized me, as it did a lot of people my age. And this was a war that was being run by Democrats, after all, begun by John F. Kennedy in many ways, and then, of course, escalated tremendously and horribly by Lyndon Johnson. So in 1968, when Hubert Humphrey was running to be as a Democratic nominee, even though he was very liberal and in many ways a social democrat. I mentioned in the book, if you read the Democratic platform, 1968, which of course, like everything else in the world, you can find online, it's an amazing platform. It goes way beyond the New Deal, it goes way beyond the Great Society, way beyond Build Back Better, for that matter. It's really, socialist parties in Europe would be happy to run on that program now, at least they would have in the recent past. But nobody cared about that. Of course, all they cared about was the war in Vietnam. So I went to Chicago to protest the Democratic Convention, got arrested, and luckily didn't spend more than a couple nights in jail. And then I decided I had enough with the Democratic Party. And when I went back home to Boston, where I was in college, I went on a demonstration up to the Massachusetts State House in 1968, on Election Day in 68. And our slogan was, vote with your feet, vote in the streets. In other words, don't vote. Demonstrate instead. Well, I wish I hadn't done that in retrospect, because if I helped elect Richard Nixon at all, I feel very sorry about that. At the same time, the Vietnam War was a terrible thing, and that's one of the 2 times in my life since I've been old enough to be a voter, I have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president. The other time was 1980, after Jimmy Carter, when I voted for a candidate maybe people don't ever remember. Ever hear of Barry Commoner?
Oh, yeah.
All right, well, some people are old enough to remember Barry Commoner. He ran for the Citizens Party, a third party. He was a great environmentalist, scientist, and this is sort of a popular front of the left at the time. He got 250,000 votes, did Barry Commoner. And Ronald Reagan beat Barry Commoner in Berkeley, California. So wow. After that, I said, forget about third parties. But I do think, I argue in the book that whatever you think of the Democratic Party, we have a two-party system. We're going to have a two-party system for a long time. And so we better try to make the Democratic Party as good a party as we can. And I say that as a citizen, obviously. But historically, I think it's, since the 1930s, the Democrats have been by far the better party.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question of you, and then maybe we should take the questions from the audience. I wanted to ask one foreign policy question, given the moment we're in right now, which was, did you find it surprising to hear liberal Democrats right now rallying behind NATO and against Putin and in favor maybe even of, sending more heavy arms to Ukraine, and Republicans in the form of Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump supporting Putin? And so is this a break from the past of the Democratic Party, this kind of interventionism, international interventionism, or is it consistent with the old Democratic Party's history?
Well,
or there have been splits all
sure.
the way along the way, I'm sure.
Of course,
Bill.
Democrats
Yeah.
were in power, and Democratic Congresses declared war in 1917, 1941, in effect in 1950, though, of course, that was a UN war, the Korean War. It was Democratic Congress, which was okay with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, which gave Johnson this blank check. So, and the whole, the Cold War order comes out of World War II, is a liberal Cold War order. I mean, it's a Cold War order which is trying to promote liberal democracies, including ones where socialist parties are very strong, but not obviously communist parties. And NATO, of course, was begun, in 1949, soon after Harry Truman was reelected, or elected in his own right. So in some ways, historically, this is a return to. But, the difference, of course, and of course, a lot of people like me, turned against that policy during the Vietnam War, and a lot of people on the left continued, and still continue, even now, to think that the U.S. can do no good in the world. And which is different from the Carlson, Trump worldview, I think, which is that the U.S. should, their worldview is more like that of the America First movement before World War II, the Charles Lindbergh kind of movement that people should take care of their own problems. We have enough to worry about here, and it's only these liberal globalists, some of whom have names like Soros, that are promoting this. But I think a big difference, of course, here is that how close Putin was to Trump, and maybe still is. We don't know, probably not. But and how much, of course, is this sort of right-wing populist autocratic coalition, you might say, which a lot of those people there are pulling away because the war is so unpopular among their own people, like Orban and I forget the name of the prime minister in Poland. But in many ways, it is a return to an older tradition. And Democrats really, despite the Vietnam War, Democrats, at least running for president, have never given up on that ideology. Now, some of it's a problem, sort of American exceptionalist idea that we never really support bad people in the world. We only support good people in the world, which obviously is not true. With Vietnam, with various dictators we've supported, with Saudi Arabia, even today. But it is, I think, ideally a good policy. And if, again, we really do promote democracy, the question, of course, is whether, as you mentioned, whether we support democracy with planes and bombs and guns. That's a difficult question, especially when the other side has something like 1,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles and who knows how many tactical nuclear weapons. That's a difficult question. It's not like fighting, I don't know, Nicaragua or something.
Here's a first of the audience questions. If Roe is overturned, can you imagine a strategy by which the Democrats can win back white Catholics and possibly evangelicals?
Yeah, you should be asking my son these questions. He's a strategist, but
well, the role of abortion in the party,
yeah.
I guess. I mean,
I think. Well, first of all, I think again, this might be controversial. I think Democrats should be open to pro-life people being in the party. Not that they will make policy. That's a matter for the people in the majority of the party to make. And of course, I'm pro-choice. And I think abortion should be safe, legal, and available everywhere. But Bob Casey, senator from Pennsylvania, is pro-life. There are a few pro-life people in the House of Representatives. I forget their names, and I think they should be able to make their arguments. In the party. That's what a Big Ten party should, I think, be able to do. If the court rules Roe, unconstitutional, it depends how they do it, of course. And there's very good lawyers here who can talk about the various ways that they might do it. They might make it harder to get an abortion without actually ruling it unconstitutional. But in that case, I think Democrats will probably be in better shape than they are now about that, because women who want to get abortions won't be able to get abortions. There'll be lots of stories in the press about that. And a lot of people, again, people of childbearing age especially, I think are going to say, well, we didn't like the idea of abortion maybe, but these women are really suffering. Is that a good thing? So I think in some ways we'll go back maybe to the way the media reported on abortions before Roe v. Wade, which was a lot about, women having terrible abortions back, backyard abortions. What were they called?
Back alley.
Yeah, back alley abortions, backyard abortions. That's even more horrible.
One barbecue and one
I
abortion.
had a friend in college, I won't say her name, who almost died from a hemorrhage from abortion like that.
Joke,
And a lot of people have stories like that right now, if this happens again.
These are also, here's another question about current politics, really. It says, Build Back Better has lots of answers to the question, what about us? But none of it seems to register. Is it just that the Democrats are inept at messaging, or is something else going on here? And I guess you could sort of, if you want to bring in some history, why is a program like that having a hard time now compared with, the FDR's huge programs for rebuilding the country, or even the Great Society programs under.
Well, there's a lot going on there. I mean, first of all, of course, FDR was able to get a lot of things passed because the Republicans were very much in the minority, and Americans knew that a lot had to be done to get the economy back. I mean, we have 25% unemployment, and people, taking to the roads in jalopies to go somewhere where they can just get a job, living in camps and Hoovervilles and so forth. You've got a lot of running room to pass programs. And FDR, of course, is, I don't want to, no knock on Joe Biden, but Joe Biden as a speaker is not quite FDR, even though he's a very empathetic guy. Roosevelt and Biden were both very empathetic, but he just, there's no memorable lines and so forth. But more important than that, I think, again, is the fact that there's not, and I'm getting back to what I said before, there was a movement behind Social Security. There was a movement behind the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act. There were huge strikes in 1934. General strikes in San Francisco and Minneapolis saying we want our unions recognized. You don't have that now. And also the Build Back Better plan is a package. I forget how many bills are in it, 7 or 8, And of course, the reason they had to put the package together is because of reconciliation and because of the narrow majorities they have in the Senate. So they couldn't get one bill passed and then another bill passed. They had to get them all passed at once. But that made it very difficult to explain to people what's in it, I think. So I haven't seen polls about this, but I would be willing to bet most people in America have very little idea what's in the Build Back Better plan. They know, sounds good maybe, and if you asked specifically in polls the different parts of it, people are for the different parts of it. But are there mass demonstrations out there? Are there truckers going on the Beltway to demand universal pre-K or taking major steps to curb climate change or including dental care and vision and hearing care in Medicare? No, there aren't, obviously. Or, for that matter, the PRO Act, which would, again, make it much easier to organize unions in America. But again, hardly anybody really knows about that act. I think the people in unions know about it. People outside unions don't know about it. So part of the problem is these are great bills, but just because people maybe like us know it, people who read the Washington Post, New York Times closely know about it, I don't think most people know about them. And part of the problem is because there's too many different pieces of it, and there's no real way to explain it. Build Back Better is just a slogan. It doesn't really explain it. And because, again, getting back to my mantra, there's not a grassroots movement demanding these things. And for that reason, it becomes Democrats versus Republicans. And if you're Republican, well, Democrats are for it. Sounds good, but, they wanted to, steal the election, so it can't be any good,
Well, there are a number of questions here about the messaging problem.
Yep.
And I guess, you can't have a mass movement unless people have a message that they can rally behind. And I'm not really sure what the problem is, but there seem to be a lot of people in this room who want to know what the problem is. I don't know if you've got the answers either, but looking back in history, how... Again,
I'm not a strategist, folks. I'm just a humble historian.
Well, if you ask Martin Van Buren, you're the first hero of the Democratic Party in your book, are there lessons to be learned from...
Well, Martin Van Buren would say, veto the second bank of the United States. It's a financial elite, and it's screwing ordinary people. But there's no second bank in the United States around at the moment. And he's also saying, make sure you keep those slaveholders on your side, or you're not going to win elections. But look, again, I think I'm not going to expect the president or Democratic leaders to talk about moral capitalism. I mean, that sounds, you have to define that. And I didn't use the term because I thought it'd be a good mass slogan. But like Democrats have to find a way to talk about how they want to help ordinary working people, people define themselves that way. And sometimes that's small business people, of course, in trouble. It's not just people who work for wages, And one of my favorite historians, politicians. He's also a historian, actually, and I was honored to have him blurb the book. Is Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, and Sherrod Brown. If you know, how many people know? Most the Washingtonians, they all know Sherrod Brown. But anyway, people in Ohio know Sherrod Brown, and people in Washington know Sherrod Brown. I'm not sure people outside those places do. But anyway, so Senator Brown talks about the dignity of work, which is a term that's taken off among a lot of Democrats, but not enough because you don't hear it that much. He's for all the social programs that all progressive Democrats are for. He's, of course, pro-choice on abortion. He talks about Black Lives Matter and racial justice and curbing police malpractice. He wants to expand Medicare and Medicaid. But he's also got strong support from unions in the state, and unions are still relatively strong in Ohio compared to a lot of states. And he really can go to communities, white communities that have been voting more and more Republican, and talk to them about how, to him, everybody, almost everybody in America works for a living, and talking about the dignity of work and enhancing the dignity of work means making workplaces better places for people and giving people more what they need, not just higher wages, but also more dignified and respected jobs. And he talks about that very eloquently. And he wins election in Ohio, which has become more and more of a red state. He'll be on the ballot again in 2024, and don't know if he'll win or if he'll run again. But I think you can learn from people like that. You can learn from people like John Tester in Montana, who's comes from a farming background. He also talks in similar ways, and he wins election in Montana, which is been a red state even longer than Ohio has been. So now these guys are both old white guys. It's true, but there are people, actually members of Democratic Socialists of America, in Queens, a place like that, who talk in similar kind of ways. They believe class is the central divider in America, not race, even though they often are people, black people, Latinos, and so forth. I'm not saying it is the main divider, but if you talk in these majoritarian terms, I think consistently, then you can do pretty well in elections. I hope so, anyway. And to me, that's the core of democracy with a small d. You want to empower the majority of people and make their lives better. I mean, that's what democracy means. And of course, they're the ones who are going to elect you or not elect you. So that's also, of course, what democracy means.
Okay, one last question, which is from
we have 10 minutes.
Oh, we have 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. The next 4 years are likely to be horrendous. Okay, this is from an optimist.
Hi, Dorothy. Hi, Dorothy. She asked me that beforehand. So.
In terms of Republican ascendancy and the rollback of liberal policies, whom do you read to provide wisdom and perspective besides yourself, of course?
Well, Jane Mayer is
right.
Wonderful.
If you want to get depressed.
Anybody know the book by Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us? Yeah, I'm sure it's for sale here. Heather McGhee was head of, I think she might still be head of a group called Demos, a wonderful group she began working on election reform, actually, and works on a lot of issues now. It's actually founded by an old friend of mine from college named Miles Rappaport, who was Secretary of State of Connecticut for a while, so he knows about voter suppression and so forth. McGee's argument is an interesting argument. That is, she says that basically white people who are, say racist things or don't support civil rights or don't support racial justice in various ways are really hurting themselves because they are allying with conservative forces which are opposed to bills and Build Back Better, are opposed to labor unions, want the government to be smaller and not to help ordinary people, want to lower taxes on the rich, as Donald Trump, the great populist, of course, did in 2017. So it's an interesting argument, I think. And she begins with a great example. On the cover of Some of Us shows a swimming pool. It shows someone of indeterminate race, I remember, diving off a swimming pool. And she begins saying that all these swimming pools in the South, which were segregated, but when they were decreed by the court and by Civil Rights Act that they had to integrate, they closed down. And so all these white people had a swimming pool, no one had a swimming pool. And they were fine with that, except when they started to say, well, gee, maybe we should, let black people in our swimming pool so we can have a swimming pool again. These are not people who have their own swimming pools, of course. So that's an example of sort of public goods, social goods, which everyone should have, and people who follow racist politicians or politicians who oppose racial justice are shooting themselves in their feet, so to speak. Is that the right metaphor? And that's her argument, which is an interesting argument. Otherwise, what can I say? There's some interesting writers. I mean, some of my favorite columnists who I learn a lot from, besides Jane, who's not a columnist. She writes these wonderful, 8,000-word pieces usually, which you should read just to the end, because the last sentence is always fantastic. E.J. Dionne is one of my favorite columnists. E.J. is also a good friend. I would read him. Who else? Steve Greenhouse, I don't know, a former labor reporter for the New York Times, writes wonderful books about labor and what labor's doing right now. And I can't remember the title of his last book. Right before the pandemic, he had a great book party at the Connecticut Avenue store of Politics and Prose. And he's still writing labor stuff about labor for The Guardian, for once in a while for The Nation, for The Times, New York Times as well. And he's, I think, follow labor report, not just because they don't just write about unions, they write about workplace issues. What's his name again, who's writing, he's sort of the labor reporter in effect for The Times right now, Noam Schreiber, yeah, who used to write for the New Republic. Noam is doing really good work on the economy as well, I think. I'm trying to think of, the problem is I read lots of history, and I'm a historian after all. I can tell you about wonderful history books that you should read. For example, let me brag about my good friend Gary Gerstl's upcoming book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, which is coming out next month from Oxford University Press. He'll actually have a Politics and Prose party in April as well. I'm not sure if it'll be here or in online. But this book really talks about the kind of thing we were asking about before. That is, how did what people call neoliberalism, that is the sort of austerity, anti-labor, pro-corporate kind of politics, take over both parties in many ways, though the Democrats less than the Republicans, and why, according to Gary, is that ending? And the Great Recession is an important part of that ending, I think. So that's to go back to the question asked before about hopelessness. I'm not hopeless at all. I think young people are more and more progressive. You see that in polls. You see that in voting. If they come out to vote, and Democrats have to enthuse them to come out to vote, as they did in 2020, as they did in 2018. It's one of the reasons Democrats took back the House in 2018, because young people came out to vote more than they have in any midterm election in history before then. And also, I think because, again, a lot of these ideas that Democrats are supporting, that people, when they hear about them, they are popular, which is not true in the 1980s, for example. Young people were more Republican in the 1980s. There were more young people voted for Ronald Reagan than they voted for Jimmy Carter or Walter Mondale. And the idea that big government is passé, no longer do we want government to try to help you solve your problems because it won't do that. That was also popular in the 1980s. That's not popular anymore. The pandemic has had something to do with that, I think. So if Democrats and those who support them in social movements can just get their act together much more, I am more hopeful. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen in Eastern Europe. That's going to have a lot to do with foreign policy does have a way, and wars especially, have a way of impinging on the best laid plans of domestic policymakers. So we'll have to see. But if that doesn't dominate the 2022 election and 2024 election, 2022 will be tough for reasons we know. But 2024, the Democrats could come back from losses in 2022 if they listen to me.
Okay, well, all right, finally, I'll ask you one. This is one cosmic question here. I think it kind of goes to your philosophy of history, maybe. It says, when the Democrats have undergone big changes, what's driven those changes? Is it big ideas? Is it social movements? Is it unions? Is it external events? Is it leaders, political leaders? And this is the last question.
That's a great
so,
question. And that's sort of that's sort of my book, right? Well, it depends on the period. We have great historians here as well, I should mention. Tim Mahar and Jim Gilbert, maybe others too, I don't see out there. The masks, I can't recognize everybody. But, it depends. I mean, look, Democrats, and this is true of a two-party system generally, when the other party F's up, then the party that's not in power gains, always, of course. Zero-sum game, And Democrats might not have won in 1932 without the Great Depression. They lost 3 landslide elections in 1920, 24, and 28, and who knows what would have happened in 1932. Herbert Hoover probably wouldn't reelected. But I do think, and I again said this before, that for Democrats to make progressive gains, not just to win an election, they need more than that. They need to pick up on the mood in the country. They need to have social movements which can express that mood to people who are not sure who they're going to vote for, that people in the middle, or who might not vote at all otherwise. And I think that's always been true. So, if Donald Trump hadn't done so badly in 2016, he probably would have won re-election. He came pretty close anyway, as you know, because we have this ridiculous system, 240, 50 years old, called the Electoral College, which makes no sense whatsoever, but, it's in the damn Constitution, so we're not going to get rid of it anytime soon. So, even Democrats have a majority of voters on their side, they can't be sure of winning presidential elections. But if they have popular programs and are able to articulate them in alluring ways and have leaders who can do that, and they have movements on their side who they can convince are on their side, that's simply put, the formula for winning, I think.
The formula.
And again, we'll see what happens in the future. I can't predict that.
Okay, it's what it took to win. So that is, Michael, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. It's such a great book. I hope everybody who hears this picks up a copy. I just found it incredibly enjoyable reading.
Well, thank you.
So really well written.
And thanks very much for Jane for pinching hit.
Glad to be here.
She's got
How
the
about one
highest
more
average.
round of applause for everyone?
Yeah.
Thank you so much to you both. I do want to mention just really quick, so E.J. Dionne will be here Saturday, March 26th for 100% Democracy, so if you need a follow-up, come stop on by.
That's also
again.
a great book, by the way, 100% Democracy. Compulsory voting, but he sells it, believe me.